Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. Tonight, with me over to my opposite side, Mala. How you doing, Mala?
I am doing very well. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
So we have no Tom or Tracy tonight, unfortunately. The invitation stopped at the letter S, so unfortunately, Tom and Tracy didn't get theirs. That's the canon reason for why they're not here tonight. So, Shop Talk is a user-driven show. We have answers if you have questions. Drop your questions in chat. We will answer them however we can. Also, if you have questions afterwards, send emails, shoptalk@tripass.org. You'll see that email address somewhere along the bottom of the screen. It'll rotate through. So just check out for that. With this, we're going to jump into the first topic very briefly because I've gone over it in some detail already. TriPass board elections are coming up. The time to nominate people, hopefully nominating yourself, maybe you can nominate someone else if you really wanted to, for a board position through November 10th. We have 3 open positions: president, vice president of marketing, and treasurer. Mala is the current treasurer, Rick Pack, VP of marketing, and I am president. We are all running again. Nonetheless, if you wish to run, let me know. Email me. And you can hit me at shoptalk@tripass.org. Next up, Azure SQL Championship is still going on. Any new information you want to share with us about that tonight, Mala?
What? The Azure contest?
Yep.
Yep. Today we just met with Microsoft today, and according to them, there are well over close to 3,000 people signed up for this. And you still have time. It is intentionally made to be a very simple contest. I haven't seen all the challenges they've put out there, but from what they were saying, it's targeted at beginners, people who want to get into Azure and are interested. And if you watch the training videos, you can easily get answers to it. I think they have 2 questions in the end related to architecture, which may be slightly a bit involved, but even that I doubt very much if it will be very hard or anything. So it's worth a try, and the prices are great. So I highly encourage it. And it's already going on. So please consider participating.
Great. Thanks for that update. Other pre-show bit of news is that I've switched my office to a different room so that I can use a different cable than the one I was using in the house. As a result, should get better performance, internet performance, and hopefully no dropouts anymore. Fingers are officially crossed on that. You just can't see them because they're off screen. So the plus side is I actually have the green screen here at full height, which I had not been able to do before. So actually I can stand a bit away from the green screen, and I actually have a legit room behind me. So it was net probably a positive. If you do hear a little bit of an echo effect, I am working on dampening the sound. I just made this move last night, so I'm not fully moved in. That said, we're going to get on with the show. So, the first topic that I wanted to hit was this concept of date buckets. Date buckets are something that are new to Azure SQL Edge. And let me share my screen here. We're going to share screen number 3. Lucky screen number 3. This is connected to Azure SQL Edge. I've got it running on a Pi over in the old office. And we have a database with some time series style data. So I have a table of historical employee access attempts. This is, by the way, a small preview of what I'm doing at Past Summit in just a couple of weeks. So, historical employee access attempt, let's say top 100. Hello, Solomon. Even though you didn't directly say hello to me, I'll say hello as well. All right, very simple data set. Basically, who logged in, when did they log in, and did we let them in? And So we have these dates and times that I've stored in UTC. Not so important for date bucket. Date bucket is a function that accepts 3 parameters. The first parameter is the date type, so the date part. I have, if I can move my mouse quickly enough, I have a week here. So I'm going to bucket this by week. I have the number of weeks, and I have the time value, the date time value that I want to decide which bucket you go into. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm saying historical employee access attempt, and I'm generating 7 rows. So also excuse my allergies tonight. It's pretty bad tonight. I'm gonna try not to sneeze all over the camera too many times. But here I'm just generating numbers. I don't have a numbers table on this database, so I'm just generating it myself. And what I want to do is say, for this employee access attempt and this employee, I want to see what date bucket looks like. So I have 1 through 7, and that'll fill in the second parameter, which represents the number of buckets, essentially. So if I have 1, basically I'll have 1 bucket per week. And what this does is it starts from 1900-0101, so this is our origin date, and breaks it up into subsets of weeks based on the difference between this access time and the origin time. So when n equals 1, we're going to have it break up every single week. And May 11th of 2020 was the starting point of that particular week. So if I go back to May 11th, that was a Monday. And my access time itself was on May 15th. Okay, so then if I have date part of 2, it's also the 11th. If I have date part of 3, it's the 4th. So what's happening here is when I have a number of weeks in the buckets of 2, we're essentially breaking this up into 2-week. So 2-week sets. You're either in the first week or the second week. If I do it for 3, I'm in 3-week sets. So first week, second week, third week, and so on and so on. This description is confusing to me, and it probably is coming off as very confusing to you as well.
Yes.
And that's okay. I want you to be as confused as I was at the beginning, and hopefully be not confused by the end. So let's look at a specific date. So April 15th, 9:22:11 p.m. And we'll look at date bucket as 2, 3, 4, and 6. This is actually an example from the docs. It says
From where?
From Microsoft Docs.
Oh, okay.
So for all of these, the date is April 13th of 2020. And the reason for this is April 13th is 6,276 weeks from the origin of January 1st of 1900. And 6276 is cleanly divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 6. So this date, which is in the week of the 13th, is going to be in the same bucket when you divide by 2, by 3, by 4, or by 6. If I pull up,
oh my,
yeah, if I pull up a calendar here, when I say n equals 1, we're basically just saying break this up into individual weeks.
Hmm.
So if I set it to 1, I just want to get essentially the equivalent of find the nearest week. And the starting point is apparently a Monday. If I say n equals 2, I'm now saying, okay, we have 2 week ranges. So value will be in one of these based on the date frame. If I break it up into 3, I have 3 possible options. Date bucket seems a little weird. Now, where it can be helpful is, here I am doing it again, split this into 3 week chunks for all of my data. And I think it starts to make a little bit more sense. So we have data in May 15th as the access time, and the weekly frame is May 4th. So May 4th, May 4th, May 4th. And then I have 3 weeks later, May 25th. So I have sets of 3 weeks worth of data. And then I have 3 weeks after that, June 15th. So I've broken it up into a 3-week set. 3 weeks later, July 6th. If I change this from a 3 to, say, a 5, I'm going to have a block of data essentially being 5 weeks. So May 11th. And if I scroll down a bit, it's going to take a little bit, but we'll go 5 weeks later to June 15th. And then we'll go 5 weeks later from that to sometime July 20 something. July 20th. So we have, now we're saying, okay, the N is the size of the bucket in terms of our date part. So this is a 2-week bucket. This is a 3-week bucket. This is a 4-week bucket, a 6-week bucket. Now I think it's starting to make a little bit more sense. And this is basically, if I want to sum up values, let's say I have my date bucket for 3-week range, and I want to count how many times a person comes in during that 3-week range. Now I can run this query, and I'm saying, okay, historical employee access attempts, and really I don't need to cross apply here. Frankly, let's cut out the cross apply. Simplify this query just a little bit. I was kind of being lazy. So break this up into 3-week buckets, or buckets of 3 weeks. And as I run this query, we see that employee 1 entered during the 3-week range starting on May 4th, 19 times. They entered 42 times on this range, 42 times on this range, and so on. So we can now group by a time frame. And the beginning of the time frame is what gets put out from date bucket. So I can also say, all right, well, what if I go 365 days back? And let's go 365 days back from January 1st, 1908. That'll put it back to January 1st of 1907, you would think. Actually pushes it back 1 day. 1 day further. Is a little interesting. Let's say 1909, knowing that 1908 was a leap year. So now our date bucket is 1230. In case you're not catching what's going on, let me push you back to 1903. Back in 1903, if I go back 365 days, my starting bucket is 1903. If I go back to 1902, that's 1902. If I say 1904, my start bucket is 1904. If I say 1905, we're only going 365 days back. 1904 was a leap year. So instead of starting 1905 0101, we actually start 1904 12/31 because we had February 29th, 1904. And I said go back 365 days, not 1 year.
Mm.
So if I said instead of days, let's say years. Years should be trivial. There shouldn't be any of this weirdness. There. So 1905, if I say 1 year, what is your date bucket? Still 1905. Whereas with 365 days, if you try to go back 365 days, by the time you get to 2020, we're now almost a full month back. So you get some really weird results. So that date part is important. Now, last bit that I want to cover. We have some historical employee access attempts, and I want to get this broken up into buckets sized at 3 weeks, and I want to get the first value of the bucket and the last value of the bucket. So the first date and the last date in that bucket for each employee ID. I have to say to select distinct. So date bucket, first value, and last value are functions. 2 of them are window functions, but none of them are aggregates. So I get back 1 row per record in the input set. But given the functions that I'm calling, given that I'm calling date bucket, which is going to essentially give me the 3-week range, the bucket value, and the first and last values of this range, I would get back a lot of duplicates. So I'm throwing a distinct in there so that I get a unique set of date bucket, first value, last value. And I wanted to point out that you can use date bucket in the order by clause. And you get back, here's my 3-week range starting on May 4th. The first date is actually May 18th, and the last date is May 22nd. So this person logged in exclusively during these dates. So between the 18th and the 22nd. And then for the 3-week period of the 25th, what we see is, wait, first value is May 18th. The last value is June 8th. So what we're seeing with first value is that it's not partitioning by the date bucket. It's partitioning by the employee ID. So, we could potentially partition by date bucket as well. At this point, I'm actually winging it a little bit. I have not tried running this particular query. Mouse over where I need it to be. And I'm not even sure if this will work. So we'll find out together. Notice the performance though. This is not performing very well. This is not a very large data set, by the way. It's tens of thousands of rows. Nonetheless, that gave us back our data. So now we have proper first dates. I did not need to do it for last date because the date bucket. Um, so we're going to be within the time frame. Basically, it's looking from the beginning of time up to the last value in that bucket. And that's the net result of that is I don't have to worry too much about looking beyond that frame. That's just window functions by default go up to the current row. And because I'm parsing through access times, basically it's going to be ordered data and will stop at the value of the current row. So this gives me back the time frames, the beginning and end time frames for each of these buckets. This is so far one of the two major time series elements that Microsoft has put into Azure SQL Edge. I'd like to see some more come in. I think that these are an interesting start, especially the concept of date buckets. So I do like that idea because think about how often we've had to do things like I need to get data aggregated by the hour. And so what I need to do is write a query that groups data basically by the hour by using the combination of date add and date diff to get the date difference from the current time and the beginning of time, and then add that number of hours so that you avoid the minutes and seconds. If we do that for days, obviously we can cast that as a date. If we do it by weeks, again, date diff. So date diff to get the number of weeks from the origin, and date add that to the origin and aggregate by that value. It's obviously doable, but I think that having a fairly simple to understand function would be helpful. I'm not positive this is the most simple to understand.
So, Kevin, dumb
yes.
question. The reason this is in Edge is because it would be useful for IoT kind of data, you think?
Yes, absolutely. So this would be quite useful for time series data.
Okay.
So if you think about the type of data you might run on a device, it may be what are temperatures of how fast or how hot is a particular machine running over a time frame. And we want to be able to check, okay, grouped in time frames of 8-hour blocks, for example. What was the average temperature? Or how many overages did we see? How many overheat scenarios did we see? Or what was the oil pressure over blocks of time? Or in my case, how many times did a person enter? Did they scan their badge and enter this building during a particular time frame? And we can see that, oh, okay, well, this person was entering this many times per week, and that behavior changed radically. Or they just stopped showing up. And it might be worth seeing, well, what happened? Did the person just move to another building? Or if they show up at a lot more often than before, is there some reason why? Maybe they moved into this building before they would visit. Now they're actually in there. So if you need to get that sort of information by a time frame in order to tell a story about how people are behaving, then that's where this sort of functionality can come into play. And you're right, that is commonly IoT style scenario.
Yeah. Although I wouldn't mind if they extended it to, regular SQL Server too. I can see use cases for that. But we're probably not going to get it.
Well, I'll preface this up front by saying I have zero secret information on this. However, I mean, we know that the code bases for Azure SQL Edge and Azure SQL Database and SQL Server are reasonably similar. It's
Mm, mm,
uh, I won't tell you they're the exact same code bases,
mm,
but they're all based on SQL Server, and
mm,
I can see things moving over between products so
mm,
that this thing shows up on Azure SQL Edge first,
mm, mm,
but I don't know that there's any sort of inherent reason why it couldn't show up in Azure SQL Database or the SQL Server product
mm,
because, obviously it works here in Edge, in
mm.
Azure SQL Edge. So maybe we'll see it. Again, no secret information that says, "Oh, well, it'll be out for the box product at this point in time." I have nothing along those lines, but I could see it making sense. There are a couple of other things in Azure SQL Edge which I'd like to see in the box product, and actually, I'd like to see more. One of those things is around how data gets how time series data is handled in Edge. And within that product, you can set a retention period. So you can say, I have time series data, and I want to say I store data by the hour.
Mm,
I want to keep, say, 90 days worth of data at the hourly grain. In
mm,
InfluxDB, this is actually pretty easy to do. You create a retention policy, you create your table, and you assign the retention policy to the table. You say retain it for 90 days, and then behind the scenes, there's a process that will remove data after approximately 90 days. I
mm,
say approximately because there's some rules around when things expire,
mm,
but it's close enough.
mm,
Azure SQL Edge has that as well.
mm,
They have this concept of create a retention policy, allow data deletion. And there's
mm,
a behind the scenes process which will delete data as it reaches a certain age.
mm,
Where Influx is a bit better is that you can create automatic downsampling of data. So
mm,
I can say I want 90 days of hourly data. But by the way, I want to take that hourly data and roll it up to daily data. And I want to keep 6 years of that. And I want to take that daily data and roll it up to weekly data. And I want to keep 100 years of that.
mm,
And you can do this in Influx very easily with a concept called continuous queries,
mm,
which are what they sound like. They're queries that run regularly. They're running continuously. And there's a behind the scene process to aggregate data as it comes in, basically group it by time frame. So if I say hourly, it'll
mm,
hold things in that hour bucket and keep track of those measures. If I have another table that's daily, again, we have buckets that are by day, and we retain data at the day grain. And in Influx 2, which is in preview, that concept changes to tasks, but the basic idea is still pretty similar. You have data come in at whatever grain, whatever base level you have, and you're continuously or you're regularly aggregating this information at several levels. This is something that you can do within SQL Server, but that you'd have to do it yourself. You would have to create the tables that are the hourly grain, the daily grain, the weekly grain, and have a query that aggregates this data and moves it into the next level up table.
mm,
It's it's something I've done before. It's something that I don't consider a bad pattern. I do consider it a bit of extra work though.
mm,
So to the extent that it'd be possible to have that sort of continuous query or that sort of automatic downsampling of data
mm,
in combination with retention periods, I think that makes SQL Server a stronger product for time series problems. It's not something that it's fantastic at today. It's pretty good at it. I mean, you can obviously hook everything up and get time series style functionality, but there is a reason that influx exists. And by specializing in time series, they're able to do some things that we can't really see within SQL Server very easily.
Fair enough.
So that was date buckets. Are there any questions from anyone in chat tonight about date bucket, or if you want to take it somewhere completely different, we're okay with that as well.
Looks like
Uh,
Solomon's the only person on chat today.
there's a few people. There are lurkers.
Oh.
I'm not going to call anyone out.
Hmm.
So if there are questions, pop them in. We'll answer them. Otherwise, we're going to switch from time series to talking about another side of, say, interesting ways to store and work with data. So Mala has learned learned quite a bit about SQL Server's graph capabilities, and has some interesting background with graph theory and with graph databases in general. And we interviewed Mala for the SQL Data Partners podcast. It is not out yet, so you won't be able to get to it quite yet. But I do want to drop a link in chat here. And if you don't know of the SQL Data Partners podcast, this is hosted by Carlos El Chacon, and Eugene Meidinger and I spend a lot of time as co-hosts, usually trying to derail Carlos, and usually successful at it. So Mala is going to show up on probably the next episode. From there, it's all about graph. It's all about a bit of graph theory in general, a lot about SQL Server and its graph product, and I think we had a bit of disagreement about the concept about graph concepts and their general usefulness.
So I wouldn't say disagreement, because I kind of lean on Kevin's side with this. Although I wouldn't totally dismiss what's out there, I do believe that SQL graph has a little bit, has to evolve a lot more to be really useful compared to what it is now. And like we know with all things Microsoft, we don't know if the powers above are going to will that to happen or not. Nobody
That's
knows.
true.
But the way it is now, um, when I started playing with it as a feature, I had some hopes for it that it would evolve into something bigger than what it is now, and it did. And as part of that adventure, I went into a few vendor products out there on graphs and looked into what they're doing. And there is a lot of hype around it, a lot of hype. And which seems to be the case with a lot of NoSQL products these days, and it's no exception with graphs. So there is all kinds of lines which I find pretty ridiculous, like like all relational stuff is going to be replaced with graph is one of them. No, really, no. That's just beyond, that's a really ridiculous claim. And technology matures with age, and graph databases are very, very new. They're only, I would say the one that claims itself to be the first one itself is barely 10 years old, barely 10 years old. And people sometimes gripe about, or used to gripe about, Oracle being superior to SQL Server. Part of the reason is that Oracle was around a lot longer than SQL Server was. I mean, right now, they're both pretty competitive, but there was a time when SQL could not do a lot of things that Oracle could, and partly because Oracle had a long time to evolve into a mature, very strong product, and that happens with age. And especially if you want to trust your data with something, it better be reliable and it better be trustworthy. And Quite a
Yeah.
lot of these products are very, very new. And if you look on Stack Overflow on how many corruption issues graph databases have, it's phenomenal. It's really huge compared to it's not that corruption never happens on SQL Server. We all know that it does, but it's nothing in comparison to what's going on, in that kind of a world. So it's not just about how easy something is to query. You need to be, you need to trust your data in it, and have reliable HADR and security and follow ACID properties and all of that. So everything is important, not just one part of it. And you can do everything in SQL that graph databases can do. That I will freely, absolutely admit. We were doing it at least in 3 different ways before graph databases came along. So it's true. But I like some features that some of these products have, including Neo4j, like the querying ability and the speed of processing if you have data that is so voluminous and mm, that kind of stuff. I think, in niche cases, it has its place. Although, that's not a lot. That's my take on
That's a fair take. Yeah, my side is I hear people say graph will take over the world, and I'm like, I don't think it will. Uh, I know that graph databases, modern graph databases, are pretty new. The concepts around graph have been around since the mid '80s. Something that pick up from Mala in the podcast is you go back to IBM network databases, and network databases were graph esque
it. Hmm.
um, from the mid to late '70s. Well, there's a reason that network databases are no longer really in use, and it's mostly because they're not very good. Um, that's my that's my hot take of the night. Network databases just aren't that good. Uh, I know there's one person. I don't think he's in chat tonight. He might take issue with my
Hmm.
dismissal of said databases, but I'm gonna go out on that limb. Um, Graph to me is a problem that has it's basically a case where you have very few problems that really require graph. And I think you get yourself in more trouble than it's worth by having a separate graph database to do work, unless you're in a situation where I work on this specialty for a living. This is our company's lifeblood. So, for example, if you're doing logistics and you have to do pathing and you have to do shortest path,
Hmm.
yeah, okay, store that data in a graph database, work off of the graph database, live with graph, and enjoy it because that's a really good use case for it. But
Hmm.
in most other cases, they're like, oh, I have an employee org chart. Okay, I don't need a graph database for that. Yes, but a graph database could make it faster. Still, I only have so many employees. We're talking hundreds of employees, thousands of employees. Still don't care. You'd have to talk about, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of people, and care about the interconnections between people before I begin to think that this might be a difficult problem in the relational world. You know, there's any graph implementation can also be done as a relational implementation. And you'd have to find specific cases where a graph implementation is going to perform much better as far as data storage goes. If you're talking about graph algorithms, I'm back on board. Like, yes, give me graph algorithms written in general purpose programming languages. You know, give it to me. Let me implement my graph in F sharp or in C sharp or in Java or Python.
Hmm.
But I don't need the data to be stored as graphs. I
Hmm.
don't need the data to be stored with nodes and edges.
Mm.
And I don't think there are that many cases where we really benefit from having our data stored in a graph format.
Mm-hmm.
So seems like a solution in search of a problem. That was the pithy quote that I was trying to come up with as I started rambling on this. There's quite a bit more that you'll be able to pick up in the podcast. I don't want to repeat too many things that I said during there, mostly because I don't remember what I said
So
because that was several days ago.
I will post a link for about a talk that I really liked, and there are very few talks on this topic that have made sense to me. Most of them, like I said before, they're seriously hyped. There are some that make ridiculous claims that acid is no longer necessary and crap like that. So, but this guy named David Betchberger, he's pretty sensible and he talks. He offers good perspectives on the topic. So I've posted a talk by him, A Skeptic's Guide to Graph Databases. That's worth listening for those who are interested. And there are a few books too that are informative, mostly informative. And most of the books, including the one that Karen Lopez wrote a preface to, which we once had on the book section on the show here, they don't recommend necessarily using graph databases. And like Kevin said, they work on a model of, you can store the data in a certain format and, write the algorithm in whatever language you choose to, and, produce an output. That is the focus. So I think it's something that is worth learning for everybody. I really enjoyed learning about it.
Yeah, I like
Yeah,
graph theory a lot. I've got a couple of graph theory, mostly the mathematical side, books
right.
over back in the office, the
Yeah.
other office. Um,
They
uh,
use GraphQL, right, in the at work where we are. I remember hearing something about it. Was it for buyer behavior or something like that? They use it, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
we've so um, we've done some stuff around predictive analytics with mostly it's social network analysis.
Right.
So yeah, there's graph concepts for sure in there, and the
So
data
what
stored
was used, like
relationally.
Cipher, or what was the language used?
This was in R.
Mm,
It was it was implementations of um, social network algorithms. Uh, I think I don't remember the package that we're using,
mm,
but we do a lot of work in addition to what the package provide.
mm.
So I wish I could remember offhand. This is something that I could have looked up beforehand had we thought about it in pre-show. But oh well.
Mm, mm,
Nonetheless, yeah, that's done in the R programming language and from data stored in a relational database. But it's
mm,
implementation of graph concepts, which
mm,
are absolutely worth learning.
mm.
So that was that was my spiel on graph. Anything that you'd like to add here, Mala?
No, I think we covered most of it.
Covered
I've
enough.
given that talk to our user group, and I know, people who are interested in, including in many parts of it, including the network database implementation and all of that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
So
oh
I'll just end with what I would wanted to see in the product in SQL if we ever wanted to use it this way. I would personally like to see good visualization, whether that's a Power BI plugin or not. I don't really care. They don't have anything there. They don't even have something for hierarchical data. Forget about complex interconnected data or anything. It just, there's no plugin that is decent for a medium-sized volume of data, and that really sucks. Without visualization, it's really hard. And I'd like for them to at least have hackathon, in-memory implementation, so that it's faster in comparison, because most of the other graph implementations, they work totally off of memory. That makes them super fast, and SQL really doesn't have that going at all for it. They have some, they implemented some of our feedback, including referential integrity and such, but not that part of it. And
Right.
we'll see if they do anything with it or not. It remains to be seen. But right now, I'm not too sure if I would want to use it in production.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'd be using Grapher very much myself.
Yeah.
Not the way that it's implemented. I see so much of the implementation that
Mm-hmm.
um like, okay, well, if I can write this in other ways fairly easily,
Mm.
why am I doing this in a graph again? Why am I doing something totally different? Uh and I might be a little bit snide on this. I'm
Mm-hmm.
willing to admit, but I don't see it filling a huge number of needs.
So I do admit that the shortest path is not too shabby
Yeah,
implementation wise, the algorithm wise, although my tiny gripe is that if there are multiple shortest paths, which there can very well be, it makes its own decision on which one it wants to show you, and that ticked me off a little bit, um, because I wanted to see all of them, and it will only show one. But other than that one small thing, you have to write a lot of code in real life to get the shortest path. So it does save you some code, some pain in that regard. But it does need to evolve, a little bit more.
right, right.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
we'll see what happens with it as new editions come out.
right,
Um, there were some improvements in 2019. Shortest Path, I think, was an addition in 2019.
right.
And you've mentioned referential integrity, so there have been improvements.
So also the other thing with the comparison with graph tools is that everything they do with quote unquote objects in SQL is a wrapper around relational. It's really not an object oriented database. So it doesn't have polymorphism. It doesn't have the features of an object oriented thing that it should have. So finding patterns and things with it, you have to code around it, which you can. You absolutely can. But like Kevin said, you don't need for the data to be stored in this model to write that much of code and find all that.
right.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to now move to the final topic for tonight. So historically, Mala has had the book corner where we've gotten to hear recommendations on different books. Uh, it's expanded. There's a bit of construction. Now it's the Mala's Books and More kiosk, which is books and more.
So I ran out of time and energy to read books lately, and I'm out of stock. I have a few on my Kindle, which I think at least one or two I'll get up to speed for the next show. But for this show, I'm going to go with a blog post and three different podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts during my walks and exercise. It helps me keep up. So one of the blog posts that I found interesting, this actually came in Brent Ozar's newsletter, was this person. I don't even know who this person is. A guy who wrote on choosing the right tools, right software. That is whether you want to go with something shiny, new, or you want to just keep something that is trustworthy and reliable. And I think he has some interesting points there. He talks about embracing boredom, and something that is just because it's boring doesn't mean you have to replace it. And I know this for a fact, considering how many implementations I have walked back into SQL even where I work in my 2-year stint. So a lot of software engineers have a need to go after shiny stuff, and he argues in favor of mindful choices, making mindful choices when it comes to technology. And it's a really well written blog post. It's worth reading.
Okay.
um the, the podcasts, the 3 podcasts from Run as Radio. If you're not following Run as Radio, I highly recommend it. It's a really professional podcast out there, and there is only a small fraction of what the host talks that have to do with databases. And I usually, check them out like every quarter or 4 months, or if I see something on Twitter to see if he has any database related topics going. And, I watch all of them at one shot. So this time I listened to 3 of them. The first one is Vicky Hart, the PM on the team, who is responsible for Azure Data Studio and Jupyter Notebooks and SSMS and all that kind of stuff. Vicky is a very dear friend, and she, as usual, she does a very professional job with this podcast. She talks about the criteria they have, or people should have when it comes to picking the right tooling, that how you don't have to put everything you want into a single tool and make multiple smaller tools out of that. She talks of SQL clee versus SQL command, and a number of other things related to SSMS and Azure Data Studio, and how you get going with notebooks and how notebooks are useful as troubleshooting tools and documenting steps involved and that kind of stuff. So it's really, I think it's only about 30 to 40 minutes and it's worth listening. The next one is Monica Rathbun, who is with Denny Cherry Associates as a consultant. She talks about serverless databases in Azure. And this is a really new concept, and the word can be kind of scary to a lot of people. It just means a hosted instance that only turns on when there is a need and turns itself off when there is no traffic. And for very special business cases where you need something like that. Clearly not for people like us who do e-business and such, absolutely not doable. But there may be other, businesses that only work 9 to 5 and shut down after that, or have very little activity outside of their normal business hours. And for that kind of people who are on the cloud, this may be an option. It may be cheaper than you're going to Azure SQL, but it has caveats. And I went oh when I listened, and the caveats are that when that thing turns off, it wipes out your DMVs and all your memory and execution plans and all of that, which really sucks. To me, you can barely do any troubleshooting if everything goes away like that. But that's what comes with it. And clearly, everybody's jumping on the opportunity to create something there for it to capture all that information before it shuts down and such, but they're not quite there yet. And it's interesting to understand the concept and what is supposedly a new offering. And according to her, she works in the consulting world. There are people who really want this kind of product, so clearly it is selling. So that is an interesting show. And the last one is a person named April Wenzel. She calls herself a compassionate coding. She's a consultant, and she talks about compassion during the pandemic, which is what, and it's not so much about being nice to everybody and not saying anything rude and such, although that's part of it. But what she talks more on, how you can take care of yourself and find work-life balance and not stress out too much and that kind of stuff, and what we're going to do when things start to clear up a little, how to get used to working less with real people and that kind of stuff. So it's a nice little talk. It's not exactly a tech one, but it's related to how our work environments are going to change as we go forward, and how we can make the best of what we have now, which some of us really find it hard. I personally miss going into a real office at least once in a while. I used to like hanging out with my colleagues, and I really miss that. So she talks about how you can cope with things like that, and it's a nice listen. So those are the 3 talks I have for this week, plus that nice blog post.
Okay. Sounds good. So, we are in the closing minutes of Shop Talk for tonight. Um, Checking brief announcements. Past Summit is coming up November 10th through the 13th. There's still time to sign up. And SQL Bits happened already, so if you go back in time a little bit, you can see SQL Bits. Data Platform Summit's coming up November 30th through December 8th. It's a lot. There's 4 days of training and I think it was 3 days of sessions. So we are getting into conference season. It's a bit of a strange conference season this year just because, well, we're not going to be able to see each other in person. Nonetheless, we'll be able to see at conferences and hopefully get some training in while everyone's stuck at home. So with that, we're gonna wrap it up just a couple minutes early tonight. I think we've hit all the topics of interest. If you do have follow-up questions or thoughts or want to hear us talk about something else, shoptalk@tripass.org, and we'll see you next time. Good night, everybody.